This project starts with the idea of adding a rooftop tent to my Jeep, but of course it's more than just putting a rack on. Springs are a little light. The Jeep sags with some weight, so respring the rear, do some repairs. Of course, can't buy a rack, gotta build one. So build a rack so we can mount our Smitty built tent onto this one. All this Jeep really needed was a 2.5-inch lift kit, I think it was. Very pleased with it. I have ample ground clearance, everything's good. The only negative, or the only thing I'd like to improve, is that when I load the Jeep, when we're going for a longer trip, not so much for a weekend trip, but our 2-3 week trip, we pack a lot more gear and I have a lot more weight in the back. And I noticed that empty, that suspension is excellent. I have no complaints whatsoever. But once we load it up a little bit, the back sits down a little lower than I wanted to. And on the rougher trails, if I'm going at it a little bit hard, I feel it bottom out once in a while. So I have some ideas. And I've done this in the past with a TJ, as I used a factory or a stock JK spring in the back, and it gave me about a 2-inch lift, and I was very pleased with the way that suspension worked. I had the stock spring and the stock shock from a Rubicon JKU, 2012 JKU, and I was very pleased with that. So I have a 2-inch lift JK spring, and has me thinking, spring rate a little harder, I can achieve that 2.5-inch lift that I want, maybe a little bit more. I can adjust it by cutting the spring. Another idea I want to develop, and let's see if we can improve that rear suspension. I'd installed these spring spacers to help that situation of the back end being a little bit low when it was a little bit loaded heavy, and they worked out, they helped for sure. But what I'm hoping to do, smaller diameter spring, more coils. I went online to a spring calculator. This has about 100 pounds more spring rate to it. You know what, I think that's going to solve my problem. And I've done this before. Not that there's a problem to solve, it's going to improve my situation. I've done this before using a JK spring. All I had to do was cut that tab or that pigtail off, and they fit really well. Actually, I was very pleased with the ride quality and the overall performance of that suspension combination. So this is what we're going to work on. So as a reference, I had measured between the two spring pockets. I had 8.25 inches, and I almost have 11. I gained a whole bunch here. Of course, this is a stiffer spring. It's got about 100 pounds more spring rate. I'm a little surprised by how much I had though. So this is definitely going to become a question of trial and error here. Cut it just right, allow for some settling of the spring. I want to make sure I get this right. I cut one coil out of the spring, and I now have 10 inches. I could probably do a full coil. So if I go a full coil, I don't want to mess this up. Full coil brings me closer to 9 inches. Redneck engineering with a calibrated glass eye. A little bit of guesswork happening here. So I chickened out, I only cut half a coil out. Better safe than sorry. And as I measure, I'm now at 9.25 inches. So I actually lost more than I expected. So that was a good move. All right, with a little bit of trial and error, I cut my first coil and went to another half. I was glad I didn't do a complete one more coil to cut out because I ended up adjusting with a 2.5-inch piece, and I have now in my measurement exactly 9 inches, and I had 8 3/4 beforehand. So I'm going to leave a 1/4 inch. It's going to lift me up ever so slightly, but more importantly, it's going to allow for settling of the spring as it finds its happy place with a little bit of travel down the road. They always settle a little bit. If you remember our trip to Waitress, sheared off the shock mount. I rebuilt this one here, which is working out really well. This shock is, I've been holding off on shocks because I knew I was going to do some suspension work, and this one is obviously done. It's no good. But what I can do, if I can put this in the hole here, this is my original location, and what I can do is relocate my shock a little closer to the wheel. There is some space here, so I'm changing my mind about this. This will allow me to use a longer shock, which will give me a little bit more travel, bring the shock pickup point closer to the wheel, better handling, and I have that space. All I gotta do is refabricate that mount, which I hate doing because it worked out so well. But you know what? A little bit of cutting, a little grinding, a little welding. This will work out really well. All right, so I have it back on the, I have the weight back on the axle, and this is where I check my ride height. I had 30 1/4. I now have 30 1/2. That 1/4 inch of settle. I think this is going to be perfect. Jeep poop everywhere. My pipe bender is probably the very first project I ever built in my shop. Quite a bit of time has passed since then. Built it with some plans off the internet. It's not perfect, but it does work. It does a pretty good job of bending some tubing.
On the bumper here?
Yeah.
How did we get the right shape? And my mind is just like.
Oh well, back in high school, I was so good in maths and about angles and all that.
I feel like that's actually legit. Wouldn't you have to be good at angles and stuff?
So there's my point, right? I hated it. Didn't understand the freaking thing about it. And when I thought that's all I could do, my shocks came in. So we can put those in now too. A little bit longer. So we're gonna have to cut and readjust for a little bit more travel. This will work out really good. So. More Jeep poop. Anti-seize compound on everything. Sure beats lifting it. Well, we're not building a rock crawler, but this will do just fine for an overland vehicle. Very pleased with this. I've repositioned the shock absorber from the original factory position, which was about here, moved it out and down a little bit. It's a little bit lower, but it's in line with the lower trailing arm. So I've actually increased my ground clearance, if we want to look at it that way, and lost a little bit, but overall I'm gaining. I'm very pleased with the articulation. The JK springs and the longer shock looks to be a very good combination. Well, that's it. New roof rack build, new springs to stiffen up the rear suspension, brand new shocks on the back, ready for the rooftop tent. That's it for the TJ. Some minor things, maintenance before we hit the trail. Otherwise, that's the winter work for this one. Next project, lift kit for the wife's Jeep.